Interview about Chrystia Freeland resigning, which I will get to in this discussion. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, critical look at Canada's role abroad. I'm Eve Engler. I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal, and it's basically been going on for about 150 weeks. Just a critical look, Canada's role internationally. There's lots of developments. I should get out at 7 o'clock for parental duties. And first of all, there's a report about climate. The planet's already at 1.62 Celsius. All of the evidence is just blowing through the all the targets for minimizing the catastrophe of runaway climate change. Canada, of course, is a big contributor. There's a story about a kind of a public letter story about 100 plus organizations opposing a Canadian mine in Ecuador. There's lots of campaigning, organizing around Canadian mining companies in Ecuador in the context of the um, uh, free trade agreement that Canada is signing with Ecuador. Uh, the There's a story on Canadian Dimension. I think it was actually a bit more than a week ago, but I don't think I mentioned it last week. It's a very good story, kind of summary of some of what's developing in Mali, Burkina Faso, in Canadian Dimension by Owen Schock. It's titled "Mali's Arrest of Barrack Employees Shows Continued Push for Sovereignty in West Africa." And it looks at some of the developments in terms of Canadian mining companies, but also in terms of foreign troops being kicked out. And that's I'd say that seems to be one of the bright spots in our world in recent months, or maybe year or two. Uh, the Canadian government put out the Arctic foreign policy, which I discussed a little bit last week. They criticized China in that a bunch, and the Chinese embassy put out a statement condemning Canada's position, and basically said that they're hyping up China as a threat, whereas China follows international law in its dealings with regards to the Arctic, and and basically this is unfair. I think I mentioned this last week, but the U.S. doesn't it disputes a number of Canadian claims. As far as I understand, China does not. And so they're talking about this North America Arctic policy, which is basically Canada, US. I believe they mentioned it like 13 times in the document, and as if it's Canada, US all in it together. But Canada actually has disputes with the US, whereas it doesn't with China. And so framing China as a sort of threat to Canada in the Arctic when its most northern tip is about 1,500 kilometers away is all part of this hyping of China. And I published a piece in Canada Files on the Canada China and the kind of looking very superficially at Canada's pushing kind of a warmongering position vis-a-vis Beijing in recent weeks and months. And I touch on a number of different files. Well, one of the ones I talk about is Canada's policy vis-a-vis the Philippines, and how Canada is really pushing the Philippines, which has taken this more under the Marcos presidency, which is, I guess, about 2 years old, has taken this more aggressive position. Today's Globe has a piece headlined "Philippines asks Canada to help watch local waters to deepen maritime security." And going back about a year, I guess, Canada began offering this satellite technology uh, around dark vessels. And so when sea trawlers or different um, fishing boats, uh, they turn off their trackers, or I don't really understand exactly how it works, but they turn off their trackers. Anyways, this technology allows for the Philippines to better account, and apparently it's largely Chinese vessels doing this, fishing vessels. But the point here is that this is all part of the U.S. getting four more bases in the Philippines, the U.S. getting behind this very controversial Filipino territorial claim, which is not just opposed by China but other countries. And and so Canada is just kind of going along with this. And in the piece, I talk about the Philippines example, and Canada had more of these did the first ever operation with Filipino vessels in the South China Sea, and this is back in the summer. And then in August, Canadian naval vessel goes docks in the Philippines, and then does an operation again in the Filipino the territorial forgetting the proper term, their economic area, and with the US. So there's all these sort of signs all across. You can look at Canada's policy on Taiwan. All of these policies, we've discussed this obviously in previous episodes, but there's just this sort of preparing the way for conflict with China, hyping up, stoking the tensions, and it's all, of course, sort of subordinated to the U.S. empire's contain China policy, which is not a policy that we should be bolstering. The head of NATO, Root, the new head, he's again all over front page of the Financial Times about the need to increase European military spending to 3% of GDP. So as they got the 2%, now it's going to move up. And so he's quoted saying, during the Cold War, Europeans spent far more than 3% of their GDP on defense. And he's saying that you don't have to cut too much of social entitlements to do that, because the social entitlements make up 20% or 25% of GDP. So you just cut 1 or 2% of the GDP, put it over defense or to military, and it's all good. But in practice, of course, means people's pensions being cut. This means fewer hospitals, etc. And so Tamara Lawrence has a good piece on Canadian Dimension, headline Greenwashing NATO. And she points out, since the Paris Agreement, all NATO members have collectively increased their military spending by over 200 billion annually. And so we're making these claims about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that the climate crisis is a major security threat. It was a major threat, obviously should be viewed as a security threat. And yet we're putting more and more money into carbon intensive military equipment, and into framing our security concerns in this very militaristic way, versus the Lytton, BC being wiped off the map by forest fires, or the devastating floods in Spain a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And so you have the head of NATO just pushing more and more down this path. And of course, Ukraine is at the center of it, and the NATO proxy war there is at the center of it. The National Post this week had a piece about it says a headline was Russian suing Scotiabank over frozen funds. And it's a student who came to Canada 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that, to go to university, and she becomes I think she's like now a permanent resident or whatever. And I think her parents sell their house somewhere in Russia, and she tries to transfer from her Russian bank account to Scotia bank account $90,000. And they basically, it's just disappeared. It's been like locked in the vortex of Canadian sanctions. And ostensibly, the sanctions are not supposed to be targeting just somebody who has familial connections in Russia or moved from Russia to Canada. But in practice, according to the story, there's all these examples of this, and there's these ways of getting a waiver, but it's like a total bureaucratic mess. And this lawyer is quoted saying, "I have had all these people come to me with this kind of problem, but the amount of money is not big enough. You got to spend your 90,000 bucks, but you got to spend 50,000 bucks on lawyer fees to get your $90,000 back, and so it just doesn't make sense, according to this lawyer quoted in the National Post. And it just goes to sort of just the severity of some of these sanctions and the sort of spillover effect that we don't tend to get too much attention for. And on the note of that, there's a piece in the Globe titled "Ukraine eagerly awaits 5 billion loan from Canada secured by frozen assets." And so the Ukrainian government, the Americans coughed up 40 billion, 20 billion, big sum. I forget the exact number. And Canada's part of this G7 agreement is 5 billion of taken from interest and other stuff from the Russian assets seized. And the Russians, of course, have responded very aggressively to this. Is just basically you're stealing our resources, and they, of course, about 300 billion was frozen back 2 years ago. And Canada's been at the forefront of pushing this dynamic, which is just kind of further entrenches the conflict and gives Russia less of a reason to come to some sort of agreement, because once their assets are taken, this is not necessarily a full throttle taking. It's supposed to just be the interest, using the interest from the Russian assets to cover the loans that Canada is giving. That's how it is. But from a Russian perspective, of course, this is, the interest is, and the profits that may be made are theirs. So that dynamic. The Canadian government inked a bilateral information security agreement this week with Ukraine. And according to the story, this is the 27th bilateral security cooperation accord signed with Kyiv since 2022. I'd seen some of these. I didn't know it was that many different accords. This is, I guess, happening at kind of somewhat below the political level, the kind of bureaucratic level between the two countries. And it speaks to just how deeply involved in Ukraine, intelligence sharing, all this kind of stuff that Canada is over the past couple of years, and of course before that as well. The Toronto Star had this big long piece. I can no longer get the Toronto Star at the library, and I don't have a subscription, or I actually think my father does, but I don't actually read the Toronto Star really anymore. But it was sent to me. Big long piece. I think it's titled "Beyond Bending the Rules: How Canada Opened Its Doors to an Unknown Number of Nazi War Criminals and Collaborators to Live Out Their Lives in Peace After World War II." And it's not, this is not a new story. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the broad outlines of this, but what this dealt with, it was the Mennonites and the role Canadian Mennonite I don't know, council or groups played in bringing large numbers of Mennonites who actually, who were collaborated with Nazis, obviously to all kinds of varying degrees, and brought them into Canada in the 1940s and 50s. And it's a pretty long article. It's quite a powerful article. A lot of details in there I didn't know, and it's quite damning, really. And as was pointed out by a friend of the show, Bhagwat Sandhu, who sent the article to me. One of the kind of not mentioned in the article is that Canada had a basically whites only immigration policy at the time, right? That's not really sort of like dealt with in this discussion. I think it's important to keep that in mind when looking at this history of bringing former Nazi people into Canada. The Wall Street Journal on Saturday, on the front of its like sort of ideas section, the second section, sort of a big, 6,000 word or kind of op-ed, big sort of think piece, is titled "Has World War III Already Begun?" An axis of autocracies led by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea is challenging the democratic world order. Now, leaving aside this sort of, obviously the democratic world order where the US overthrows governments at will, where Canada's been involved in 20 plus coups, leaving aside, that kind of framing, uh, and for the fact that for the most part, this fighting is going on via proxies still. This is not, direct war. Uh, the fact that the Wall Street Journal is not just, you see this quite a bit in like left sort of circles about, World War III has begun, and the fact that the Wall Street Journal, and it's the editor of their it's the head foreign correspondent or whatever, who writes the piece. Um, I find it kind of interesting that you sort of see some of this coming from the left, and in this case, obviously coming from the right, about this, has World War III begun? And, I don't know that I think this is horrible. Let's first of all, let's be this is it's obviously, horrible that we're even kind of in the vicinity of that, let alone if it's actually begun. Um, and I think that there's some of this framing this is a little bit dangerous because I do think it sort of hypes up things in a way that becomes a little bit self-fulfilling. But I think that at the same time, there is all kinds of signs of these different conflicts kind of merging, and that's of course very dangerous, and it's something that we should be doing everything we can to pull back from. One of the people in Canadian uh, foreign policy or Canadian politics has been kind of one of the drivers of this is, of course, Chrystia Freeland, who resigned today in a very dramatic letter. And it's not clear exactly what she's doing. Is she trying to get Trudeau to fall? I think that may be what she's doing. Obviously, she's positioning herself as a bit more of a fiscal conservative right-wing liberal to take over from Trudeau. That is I'm certain that's one of the elements in all this. And I just published a piece. I kind of whipped together things that I've written about Chrystia Freeland previously, and published a piece about her resigning on my site that people can see. But it's really, it's good to go through a little bit. And I just did an interview with Jeremy Appel, which I think I just posted to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute YouTube channel, looking at Freeland, what this resignation and really looking at her foreign policy. And it really is completely remarkable that when Freeland was appointed foreign minister, replaced Stéphane Dion, who represented a slightly less imperialistic and militaristic faction of the Liberal Party. The U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, and she was appointed after Trump's first mandate, that the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa cables the State Department saying that Canada adopts America First foreign policy. And what's remarkable about it is, I mean, this is, you could say, okay, this is kind of jokey language within the diplomatic realm. You could, I don't think diplomats don't tend to have jokey cables, but you could frame it like that. But the fact that the media just completely, no coverage of this thing. This is reported on in the gray zone. It's a, Communist Party researcher, Jay Watts, then Communist Party researcher, who I believe uncovered it. And it, it circulates in kind of the left world, but it's just, as far as I know, has never been mentioned in any major Canadian media, that this is how the U.S. Embassy is referring to Chrystia Freeland. And Chrystia Freeland is just like over the top lauded by the dominant media. It's just actually stunningly sick to see how much she gets, these sort of long Globe and Mail. I've talked about a couple of places, long Globe and Mail, 2 pages. There are 5 top foreign correspondents. I guess this was just before the 2020 election, maybe. The 5 foreign correspondents just all The realm of debate is that is she too much of an idealist who is trying to bring democracy and women's rights around the world at the expense of Canada's economic interests and reality, or right, like the criticism is not that she's there's you can't even hear, there's not even one person in the 5-10,000 word piece that says, well, she's actually a pro-American, pro-imperialist voice. It's this debate: is she too much of a dreamer who just wants to bring democracy to the world's peoples, and human rights and the international rules-based order? And of course, Freeland, as we've seen in the past 14 months, has gone to these genocide rallies, said Canada supports Israel back in 2018. A wonderful, fascinating quote where she says, um, when Canada's bid for a Security Council seat, she says, if Canada wins a seat in the Security Council, will act as a quote asset for Israel, right? Like our bid for a Security Council seat is to so we'll act as an asset for some other country. And of course, this whole international rules-based order stuff has been just totally exposed as completely fraudulent over the past 14 months of Israeli violence. And this Israeli violence, it's remarkable. It's honestly, it's stunning to see it just keep going. The horrors still last 24 hours coming to Gaza, wiping out schools, families, all these kids being just like incinerated. It's just it's incredible. There's the Guardian piece from the some NGO. They surveyed. It says 96% of children in Gaza feel like death is imminent. 49% want to die, right? Of the children in Gaza. It's just absolutely beyond belief. The Air Wars did their report on the October killings. Not They've never seen anything like it, or this century, about the amount of civilians killed, the proportion of that are civilians killed. They do a real like a intensive look at I think like 600 strikes in October of last year. And this is just evidence. I mean, it's all over, right? There's just different ways of coming at the issue. Um, and yet you got the National Post saying Hamas vastly inflated Gaza death statistics, the study shows, when everyone knows that it's actually total opposite, right? We just passed the official 45,000 dead. Well, first of all, there's I think something around 20,000 known to be missing in the rubble or missing. Okay, so that almost all dead. But then that's just the direct kills, not all the indirect deaths. So everybody knows that if you take the sum total here, there's not a chance it's under 100,000. But the National Post is still like claiming that these statistics, which are almost certainly correct, the Gaza Health Ministry statistics, but that they're still doing this genocidal propaganda. Owen Schock has a piece on Canadian Dimension, which kind of adds to something I talked about a little bit last week about this Israeli historian who has the headline of stories: Israeli historian accuses Canadian media of enabling Gaza war crimes, and he sort of flushes out some of the bias in the Canadian media. Now, the other side to this Israeli violence that's just incredible. There's 800 strikes in Syria in the last, what is that, 4, 5, 6 days. 800 strikes. Have you seen some of the images that last night, talking about like a 3 on the Richter scale of a earthquake 3, the huge, like a kind of mushroom cloud type thing of Israeli bombing. They just destroyed incredible amounts of Syrian military equipment, of other infrastructure stuff. There's these reports about Syrian scientists being assassinated. It's a little bit unclear what's going on there. But they just take advantage, and they just bomb and they bomb and they bomb. It's like they're bombing the hell out of Gaza. They've bomb the hell out of Lebanon. They're still, violating the ceasefire stuff, and then they just unleash insane amounts of violence in Syria, and they just get away with it all. It's just remarkable to see this play out. This last couple of days has been all these protests and criticism of the Palestinian Authority security forces who killed a young, I think like a 12 or 13-year-old in Jenin, and they killed a Palestinian Islamic Jihad resistance fighter in Jenin, and I guess they're trying to basically squash or crush the sort of resistance forces in occupied Jenin. So this is Palestinian forces amidst the Holocaust in Gaza repressing Palestinian resistance fighters. I mean, it's we think about the colonization that's taken place to have that happen is unbelievable. Hezbollah, Ansarallah, some groups in Iraq, have actually had some like concrete resistance in solidarity with those being incinerated in Gaza. But in the West Bank, it's mostly been quiet. And it's mostly been quiet in part because the Palestinian Authority security forces are a subcontractor of the occupation, of Israel's occupation. And it's a totally, I'm just doing a piece on this. I'm not adding really anything new, but just sort of updating stuff about Canada's role in all this. 2 decades. Canada has been uh, funding, training, assisting the Palestinian Authority security forces with the explicit intent of suppressing protests against Israel's crimes in Gaza, in the West Bank. The roots of this security arrangement is the Palestinian Civil War and basically trying to isolate Hamas in Gaza, and we're basically building up, and we've been building up this security force that's vetted by the Shin Bet, the internal Israeli intelligence, to control the occupied West Bank while Israel steals more land, while it unleashes untold horrors in Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority seems, I don't know this for sure, but it seems like they're trying to show the Americans and Israelis that we're like we can rule our little tiny part of the West Bank that we supposedly rule. So you can trust us to rule Gaza later on, whenever you want us to rule Gaza, that kind of dynamic. And so we're going to repress Palestinians as part of showing Washington and Tel Aviv that they could maybe do that in Gaza. That seems like what's going on here, and this is Canada's aid, right? This remarkable. The Globe had a piece back in mid-November. I didn't talk about this, but a piece about Operation Proteus, which is Canada's military mission in the West Bank, 2-decade old military mission, and they it's an okay piece. They make it clear that it's sort of anyone who knows a little situation knows that it's the Palestinian Authority forces sort of squashing Palestinians, while Israel doesn't. It's supposed to be about preparing for a Palestinian state when in fact Israel is not doing anything in that direction, and but they ignore, and the media just in general ignores the one of the more remarkable documents in recent Canadian foreign policy is this 2012 note from Margaret Biggs, the head of Canadian International Development Agency, where she talks about how the Palestinian or the Israelis are imploring Canada to keep aiding the Palestinians because Harper had threatened to cut off aid to the Palestinians if they pursued their statehood bid. And the Israelis are pushing Canada because this is basically a tool to squash popular protests. That's the word the head of Canada's aid agency uses, popular protests. So this is, it's all like out there. and yet it doesn't get talked as memory hold, right? It just this is piece of Canadian foreign policy history that's still very relevant that just gets completely, is reported on. This was reported on Post Media. This is not me making up. This is reported on one time and that's it. I've referenced it probably a dozen times in different articles or books or whatever. But from the popular record standpoint, it's just gone. Um, on the note of foreign interference, I was thinking a little bit of foreign interference because there's this complaint to the Canada Revenue Agency on NGO Monitor. An NGO Monitor, which is not a Canadian-based organization, basically tries to intimidate civil society organizations opposing genocide and apartheid. And NGO Monitor, though it raises money in Canada, tax receipted donations like 300 but about $1 million over the past since 2020. So varies each year, but 300,000, something like that a year. And this is an organization that's really close to the Israeli government, and they played a role in getting Samidun listed as a terrorist organization. Now they're going after Palestinian youth movement, calling for Canada to ban the Palestinian youth movement, which has been an important player in different demonstrations and the encampments at universities and stuff. And so it's getting subsidized. All taxpayers are subsidized this Israeli organization, very close to the Israeli government, to basically intimidate Canadian civil society against opposing genocide, which is obviously a total scandal. But it got me thinking a little about the whole foreign interference angle, and it's really like two sides to this foreign interference. Like if you got like I don't know Uruguay. Embassy is hosting all these events to I don't know promote. I don't know what Uruguay promotes, but or maybe let's take Mexico hosts events to promote tamales, and they really have a big campaign in Canada to really push tamales. And it's in a sense it's foreign interference. It's like okay, who cares? They're promoting tamales, right? So it's like so there's two elements to the foreign interference, which is one is what you are promoting and what the form is, and the allegations, of course, against India of assassinating somebody. That's a really bad form. Uh, uh, but when you think about NGO Monitor and like intimidating civil society organizations is not it's not they're not killing people as far as we know. They are making people's lives difficult, probably getting some people maybe to lose jobs. The form is not the most benign, but it's not the most malevolent uh, either. But the aim is right. These Israeli organizations, they're basically this is foreign interference on behalf of a Holocaust. That is a pretty bad. You can't think of much worse aim of foreign interference. And I feel like that's something that should be more flushed out in a lot of the foreign interference discussion. And of course, when the Canadian taxpayers are subsidizing that, in the case of NGO Monitor, that's a total scandal. There's a piece, it might be a bit more than a week ago on Mondoise, a good piece on genocide as charity, a critical look at Mizrachi Organization of Canada, and which is this hardline ultra Zionist group that's a registered charity. There in the Le Devoir and Journal de Montréal this week. There's a couple things about Palestine that are really remarkable. To see how the Quebec government, the CAQ government, has really morphed their anti-Muslim and their anti-Palestinian thing together. And the headline in the Le Devoir is Legault, the premier, lit islamisme, prière de rue et campement pro-palestinien. Des associations sont intervenues pour dénoncer l'instrumentalisation des musulmans pour le premier ministre du Québec. So basically, he's connected. So the Quebec government is calling for banning of all public displays of prayer, which is just insane. It's insane, and they've said they're going to, do the notwithstanding clause because this would, of course, violate the Canadian Charter. And like, I mean, if I kneel down and I'm stretching, or if I kneel down and I'm like praying, like how are we going to figure that one out, right? Like I stretch a lot, and I think sometimes people see me when I do it on the street, or whatever publicly, they think I'm praying or something. Anyway, which I'm not. But so anyways, this is totally bananas kind of thing. And Legault is doing this, and he's basically citing the prayers at these Palestine demos, that sometimes before the demo there's a prayer on the street, and that there was like some prayers at the McGill encampment, and just kind of whipping this all together. And he's just, they're so far down the anti-Muslim path in Quebec that they're just, they're basically just rabid anti-Palestinian, uh, which is a historical shift. And the Journal de Montréal story says that, so at the National Assembly in Quebec City, they have all, I guess, this code, of conduct that bans certain words being used based upon them being like trying to, a civil discourse and whatever. But the word Hamas, according to the headline in the Journal Montréal, Hamas et menteur, which is liar, have been interdit, have been they're not allowed anymore. And the reason, so liar seems pretty straightforward, but the reason Hamas has been outlawed is apparently Legault was just repeatedly accusing Quebec Solidaire of being Hamas whenever they, I don't know, whatever, something about Palestinian rights. And just to give you a sense of how extreme this anti-Muslim kind of Quebec anti-Muslim stuff's just morphed into this really anti-Palestinian stuff. And the Bloc Québécois came out this week in saying that they really criticize this idea of quotas for profs. So there's this parliamentary report, which I'll get to in a second, that calls for quotas for one tool, and this was brought up by the Islamophobia envoy. One tool for combating anti-Palestinian racism or Islamophobia is trying to hire more people, Muslims or Palestinians or whatever. It's you know, as a general idea, totally innocuous. When you get into the details, maybe it can get a bit more complicated, but a totally innocuous idea. But they picked up on it, huge kerfuffle about it. And Bloc Québécois has come out hard against that this week. And so apparently what's happened here, and I don't fully understand the details, there's a CBC piece and a Canadians for Justice piece in the Middle East, CJPME article that I read on this, is that, so the CBC piece's headline, Liberal Caucus Split Over Racism Report Backs Concept of Anti-Palestinian Racism. And this is from the Justice Committee report on anti-Semitism. So there's these two reports. So there's this report that comes out, which the liberals and the NDP are the, I guess, majority, and they sign off on anti-Semitism, and it's really bad. And it basically says that these camps are anti-Jewish, that the IHRA should be looked at, a whole bunch of things that are just basically attacks against opposition to genocide. And the NDP has signed off on this. And so CJPME, they conclude their article saying, CJPME urges NDP to publicly condemn the report and clarify that pro-Palestine protest, including BDS, is not anti-Semitic and should not be opposed by the federal government. But the headline of the CJPME article is that there's these two different reports. So on one side, they have this terrible anti-Semitism report that's targeting Palestine solidarity. But on the other side, the liberals have basically okayed, or this report has moved along, the notion of anti-Palestinian racism. And so the CJPME headline is Parliament's two reports acknowledge anti-Palestinian racism while perpetuating it. So the anti-Semitism report perpetuates anti-Palestinian racism, but then they also accept it. So this is the muddle that the NDP still is stuck in. They can't just come out and say, we call BS. this anti-Semitism, brouhaha is just pro-genocide uh, enabling. Uh, um, and But so they can't come in and say that yet. So a couple things on that front. The front page of the Gazette on Tuesday, Montreal Gazette, is big all the top. Jews feel unsafe in city. And it's the Côte Saint Luc mayor, who's Côte Saint Luc's a heavily Jewish area in West Montreal, and so Jews are unsafe in Montreal across the board. And there's the Free Press is an American, that former New York Times person, I'm forgetting her name, serious Zionist. She runs that website, I believe, and it's the headline of this piece: "The explosion of Jew hate in Canada." And apparently Montreal is the hub of Jew hate in Canada, which I take honestly at this point it's to be viewed as a badge of honor for the city, which is just another way of saying that there's lots of opposition to genocide. The Globe and Mail publishes that Letterman, the BC correspondent, who's this um, liberal Zionist Jewish woman, and the headline is Selena Robinson tells all about her exit from the BC NDP. And it's just this bemoaning of Selena Robinson, the overtly racist NDP cabinet minister in the provincial government. And her book comes out, and she's complaining about how much anti-Semitism there is in the NDP, and she's so hard done by. And this Letterman in the Globe, just she frames herself as a sort of liberalish, and just echoes it all. It's all really unbelievable to watch 14 months into these horrors in Gaza. But this is an issue, and it's a sensitive one because it gets to historic tropes. But the reality is that someone like Lenderman, or I forget her name, and that woman in Toronto, I'm forgetting her name too, former National Post person, like the overrepresentation of Canadian Jewry in influential ideological positions within that Levitt, the corporate lawyer in the National Post, um, oh, Martin Cogue-Roan, or whatever his name is in the Toronto Star. Somebody sent me an article, just insane, another insane piece from that guy. Frames himself as sort of liberalish, but they're Jewish from a background of serious Zionism, and their sensitivity to anti-Semitism is just completely out of proportion with the objective facts of the injustices of this world. And so there's a again, it's a uncomfortable subject because it does get into tropes of sort of like Jewish influence within the media sphere or ideological sphere, but it is an element in understanding why the Canadian government and Canadian political life continues to be so anti-Palestinian. Is that someone like Letterman or Hederman or whatever pronounce her name in the Globe and Mail, she's really sensitive to Selena Robinson, the trials of the NDP MP or NDP cabinet minister who just wanted to say that Palestine was a crappy piece of land and just wanted to intervene in a college to basically get a professor fired for opposing genocide. And how dare she feel uncomfortable as a Jewish Zionist woman in the BC NDP. That speaks to the Globe Mail columnist. There's a prof at UBC in the public health department who posted about not being reappointed to his position after 7 weeks, or after this op in the Tyee, calling about the culture of silence on the genocide. Very soft piece. I read the piece in the Tyee. Very soft piece. Calls out the public health department at UBC a little bit, but it's really, really soft. I got an email about apparently activists in Vancouver today or yesterday. Cops basically busted down their door in the morning. This is just sent to me. I don't know the details. I haven't seen it public yet. About the Vancouver police going hard at Palestine solidarity activists. On the more positive note, the Muslim Medical Association of Canada, the Windsor chapter, gave $1.2 million to the University of Windsor to set up a faculty of law to establish a chair in Palestinian human rights studies, which is good. I mean, I wouldn't, if I was in control of $1.2 million, I'd put it into, different political activism than that. But in the mainstream world, this is a good thing for two reasons. One, in that having a position in the, chair in this position is probably going to lead to some good research, but it's also, of course, a pushback against University of Windsor. Was, I think, the only or one of the only universities in Canada that really came to a proper agreement with the student encampment. And then there was a bunch of Jewish donors and organizations that really hyped up that they lost all this funding. And so this of course, raising 1.2 million bucks, that's not that's a significant amount of cash. So it would push back against some of this business of if you stand against genocide, that you're going to get hurt financially from a university standpoint. The other thing, finally, I'll end off with is Canada voted on yes to two different UN resolutions, which was a change in policy, and that's a small victory. And I'll leave it at that. And if people have comments or questions, I will make Laura a co-host.
I feel there are, okay, wait a minute. Okay, Nadia, you go ahead. I'll ask you to unmute. Nadia? Okay.
I just unmuted, okay?
Okay, thanks.
All right. Thank you again, Eve, for your presentation. Once again, I agree with you that Legault is using the Muslims. He's demonizing Muslims again with every time, but he mixes things together. There's a big difference between praying in the streets and between the Palestinian issue and people demonstrating in the streets. There's a big difference. One should not mix one with the other. And I want to remind you that the Supreme Court of Canada has already decided that the mayor of I forget the area in Quebec. The mayor was trying to have prayers, Christian prayers, before the meetings, and the Supreme Court of Canada said no. You do not have Christian prayers in a public institution where people have different beliefs. So I think one should not dismiss the fundamentalism and the extremism of some extremist Muslims who want to pray in the streets. I'm sorry, you have places of cult, you pray in your mosques or at home. You do not make a spectacle of yourself by occupying the streets or the parks or the airports to pray in them, neither you nor any Christians nor any other faith. So, one should make the difference between the justified cause of the Palestinians, and which should not be mixed with the integrism, the fundamentalism of of a faction of Muslims, not all of them, a faction of them.
Yeah, I'm an atheist who honestly, religion is just completely off my radar. Not what you would even call like spiritual, whatever. I think it's totally out of bounds, completely out of bounds to try to ban prayer in public. that I don't even know how you would, I don't even know how you, that's not even conceptually possible, in my opinion. Like you literally, if someone wants to go in some park and sit next to a tree and, like put their hands together or not put their, I don't even, if their hands are together or not, how do you know if they're praying in, right? So this is just absolutely um, a demonization effort that Legault knows is not actually practical. It's just a totally should be rejected wholeheartedly. That doesn't mean that has nothing to do with a public council meeting having a prayer. I totally agree. Public council meetings should not have prayers. I totally agree there should not be religious symbols at the National Assembly. We should try to eliminate religious symbols from like as much of the sort of official political whatever as possible. But that has nothing to do with banning prayer in parks, or I'm walking along the street and I'm praying to myself. It's just completely impractical, and so obviously so. It's just an effort to attack Muslims, and it's an absolute like most kind of vile racism between the Parti Québécois and the CAQ that includes this really big anti-Palestinian element to it all. So I don't think we should be. But again, and then the bigger picture, I'm going to repeat this, but the bigger picture is if you're going to go towards secularism, which I don't um, uh, theoretically oppose. You start with the powerful, and then make your way down. You start with the cross at the top of Mount Royal. You start by getting rid of all these Saint Catherine, Saint Laurent, all the Saint streets that are everywhere. Saint Domingue, go on and on and on in Montreal. You start in that process of the powerful, and then you work your way down. And the Muslims, quite frankly, are at the bottom of the totem pole. And I'm not. This is not an argument. Again, I'm an atheist. I don't really, I'm very ambivalent to hostile towards, religion, but it's a question of power and how that's gets played out like that. But anyways,
Okay, Lynn, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're having resolution issues with the local Boulder thing. And they're not wanting to do a defund. I mean, they probably wouldn't even do a ceasefire. But something substantive, defund and reparations. But the opposing parties are saying anti-Semitism. And what I'm asking is, well, maybe I want to support the anti-Semitism because, first of all, there's a incorrect attribution to Jews as being Semites. They are not. Palestinians are Semites too. So all you're saying with anti-Semitism is don't hate Jews and don't hate Palestinians. So I support that. But I don't support the attribution of anti-Semitism being co-opted for just Jews. So what do I do when it comes up?
well, I don't know the details of exactly of what the resolution is. The argument around the term anti-Semitism has taken on a form of reference to European Jews. That's kind of the roots of it. So I've always been very ambivalent about the kind of somewhat semantic arguing around that. I think obviously, you know, we have to have some ability to mock those who uh, make a fool of themselves. And those who are constantly labeling anyone opposed to genocide as anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, we have to have forms of mocking, of reappropriation. The joke that you saw a lot with the Palestine South Africa. This is where I sort of associate with some of the Palestine Solidarity South Africa, where they have that shirt that says, or if you haven't been labeled an anti-Semite, you're not doing enough for justice, or some variation of that. I think things like that, we have to have ways of not fearing the label and in fact okay, if you want to make a mockery, if CJ and Michael Levitt and Anthony Housefather want to make a mockery of you know, anti-Jewishness, sorry, I mean, like, okay, it's not, that's not my problem. That's your problem. And if you want the word to mean nothing and you want to like, so okay, I mean, right. So I think that we do have to have some of that, and people are very um uncomfortable about doing that because they think that that's just making light of anti-Semitism or whatever, making light of the Nazi Holocaust or whatever, however you want to frame that. But yeah.
Go ahead, Hans.
I'm going to put in a question probably for next week. Mexico has just elected or inaugurated Claudia Sheinbaum, and she has come in with a very sweeping, very leftish sounding platform. I heard Tony Leah of Unifor uh, comment on this on the Taylor Report a week ago. And I think now with the tariffs front and center, we in the left should counterpose or at least examine what her response to Trump is. And maybe we should advocate that we should make common cause, because after all, Trump is directed mainly against Mexico. And he's, at this point, very successfully dividing and conquering the two borders.
Yeah,
So I put in a plug. Maybe next week you can delve with that issue, unless
yeah. Well,
I missed it in previous weeks.
Yeah, I did a piece on Maud Barlow that kind of contrasts the Canada-Mexico stuff. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah, I read it.
And
Yeah, but that dealt with the locals. I want a reading of how we approach Mexico and its new radically left government,
yeah,
or supposedly radically
I
left
tried
government.
a few months ago. I tried to do an interview, like kind of a standalone interview with getting his name right now, who's based in Mexico, and he never got back to me. And I wanted to kind of delve it because there's a series of issues, not just like, the Mexican government and how left wing it is or not left wing, or, that kind of question. But there's also a whole bunch of Canadian specific elements with regards to mining, with regards to pipelines that Canadian companies are kind of in conflict with the sort of nationalist economic policy of AMLO and then Scheinbaum continuing. So I asked, that was kind of the angle I wanted to do, but I agree with you that there is um, some interesting, to like, we saw there was like sort of a blip of media coverage about Trudeau was very compliant in the face of Trump's threats, whereas Scheinbaum was much more, sort of, we're going to respond with tariffs in kind, and Mexico is a great. I had a comment about civilization that you probably saw that, like, mocking Canada, and I basically agree with her. I mean, it's a little bit it'd be a little bit anti First Nations, you could argue, but in Canada, but clearly, in many ways, Mexico is much, sort of greater civilization. But but um, but yeah, I agree. That would be somewhat interesting. I don't know if the foreign policy hour would be the right format or more of a actual discussion. If someone happens to know, an English speaking leftist in Mexico, that would, the right person to sort of delve into some of this with, I think that would be actually quite a good interview, a combination of discussing a little bit of what Canadian companies have been doing in Mexico, but then also the kind of how Mexico's responding to Trump's threats. I think that would actually be quite a important and useful theme to unpackage.
Okay, we'll go
Well,
here.
actually,
Just wanted to tell you, if there's a guy on Soberana Analysis, do you know this? It's all about Mexico. And one of them lived in Canada for quite a long time. and he's pretty good, and he's had programs about what Scheinbaum's doing. But anyway, I can tell you that later. Go ahead.
You want to send me
Actually,
an email or send
Okay.
me a name? That'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
actually, I was actually just about to say, Laura, that there's a guy I'm also blanking out on his last name, but his first name is Kurt, and I believe he does that show you were talking about, and he is an American Mexican based in Mexico who does very good stuff, breaking down the left accomplishments that's taking place in Mexico. Actually, Eve, I'll send you the website, but check out Mexico Solidarity and get in touch with one of the people. And actually, funny enough, you mentioned my friend Jay Watts, who broke the story of Chrystia Freeland's Canada wants to have an America first thing. He's actually part of the Mexico Solidarity campaign. Jay's been on my program twice actually to talk about Mexico. He would be a very good person to talk to because actually, uh, he was former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, and he says that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's happening in Mexico, which the Western left, particularly in America and Britain, have completely dropped the ball on, and that there's lots of good stuff happening in Mexico. So I would definitely check him out. And Kurt, Laura can give you details on his podcast, which is really good. But I wanted to ask you, Eve, very quickly, your thoughts on the slander case against the Globe and Mail being dismissed. Will we see more of these kinds of, bullshit accusations when the deep state and its favorite tabloid, the Globe and Mail, decide to undermine efforts for any politician and people power movements when they want to not be so hostile towards said enemy of anyone in Canada? And when it comes to Freeland, are we seeing the beginning of the ends of Trudeau and a possible coup or leadership challenge against him led by Chrystia Freeland and her faction of the Liberal Party, like Anthony Housefather, who are rabidly pro-NATO and the pivot to Asia and want Canadian troops on the ground in the form of NATO or Canada itself in both Ukraine and Russia and possibly China?
Well, first of all, what happened with the Globe Mail? This dismissal of a case? I didn't see that.
Sorry, I actually muted him. Can you unmute Yuri? Sorry.
Well, apparently the politician who sued the Globe in Mail for slander or whatnot, apparently that case was dismissed.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that Chrystia Freeland does represent, back to the